Hey, everybody. With us once again is Bryant Thomas with a long career in journalism and Mark Collinsworth, a financial expert. And tonight's topic, a hot one this past week, is how the economy is doing, the latest economic reports, and what that bodes for the future. Now, let me say on the left is Bryant Thomas, and kind of on the right is Mark Collinsworth. And I think I'm in the middle as a moderator, an objective, hopefully, a moderator. So, Brian, first of all, you're not buying the blame on Biden. You think it's actually companies that are taking advantage of the times and price gouging, hiking up prices, correct?
Well, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that the price hikes that we've seen, even if you incorporate them into multiple levels of product markup, they don't even begin to come close to what we've seen at the retail level. So somebody's making a lot of money here along the way somewhere. It's hard to pinpoint, which group is actually capitalizing on this run up in prices more than another. But, I don't think, I just don't think that what we've seen here is a direct result of the war in Ukraine. I think that's we talked about this before. We have a country, Russia, supplying about 4% of the energy into this country, and even if you shut it off in one fell swoop, which we damn near did, I can't for the life of me understand the kind of disruption to the market that 4% product loss would have caused. I just don't see that happening without somebody, playing games along the way somewhere.
All right. So, Mark, do you agree with Bryant that this is manipulation by the big corporations? It's price gouging, price fixing, and Ukraine isn't that big a factor? What do you think?
Well, I will agree that Ukraine's not that big of a factor, but I will say that the inflation that we have right now, you can 100% blame it on the current administration. And, just talking, when Donald Trump was in office, even when previous presidents were in office, nobody raised prices then because those presidents weren't cutting the oil supply to the bone. I mean, look, just yesterday, Biden said he was going to cancel leases in Alaska, which is our largest producer of oil. He stopped a pipeline. Oil prices have been skyrocketing under him. You look at food. I saw a report today that one of the reasons we have shortage in stores is because they're sending food to the immigration camps that are on the border. And some of the food that we as Americans should be consuming is being sent to other people. I just see it's called inflation for a reason, because it's 100% the administration. It's not companies price gouging.
All right, but I think Brian's argument is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, that despite some of these factors, they could play some role in it, but the figures don't add up where there is such a sudden increase in prices. So where is Brian erring in his math here?
Well, part of the reason is a lot of the costs are indirect costs. Okay, so like let's say for farming, for instance, when you have these shutdowns, who implemented these shutdowns? That was from the administration, correct? Well, when you do these shutdowns, a lot of the logistics systems that transport food, trucking, warehouses that actually clean and box the food, those businesses were shut down due to government orders. So a lot of food literally rotted on the back of trucks and in fields just because the farmers didn't want to take the time to even harvest them. Adding on top of that, there's a transportation cost. With rising gas prices, that causes the prices of tractor fuel to go up. The transportation cost to move things.
Well, when people make the argument that this didn't happen under Trump, the counter argument, I think, is always one of them, is that, they didn't have an excuse under Trump. And all they needed was a little bit here to take a mile with the price increase. In other words, there was no obvious excuse under Trump that they could seize upon, that they could capitalize upon. Does that make sense?
Well, I think that there's some validity to that. there's no question that oil traders, I think, have been itching to pull this trigger for quite a while. Anytime they could point to any trouble spot on the globe, it was worth a dime, 15 cents at the pump. And this thing with Russia and Ukraine was, like the mother lode for price hikes. So I think that, Mark is right. If you have all of these things in confluence, then, obviously there's going to be a movement upward. And I just think that if you took the energy component out of inflation right now, and just settled oil prices back to even where they were before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the inflation rate would take a dive along with it. And I don't see that happening. I think the wheels are moving here, and probably the only thing that's going to really stop it will be a full-fledged recession. But who knows? I mean, you can't predict what the market is going to do anymore. I've given up trying to spot trends, and I don't know, maybe Mark has a better insight on this.
But getting back to your main point of contention between the two of you is, Bryant, you're still saying that the figures don't add up. There is no real justification for such a steep hike. And Mark, you're saying that it does add up, and kind of summarize that for us. Why do you think it's not companies taking advantage of the situation, going way beyond what they have to with their prices?
I'll use a quote from one of the White House staff. The Transportation Secretary Buttigieg said just yesterday that all the government spending that was done under the Biden administration caused prices to go up. I mean, who better to state it than someone that actually works on President Biden's staff?
See, that's another, given, at least among, I guess, conventional economists, that as you inject more money into the economy, it does cause inflation. But Biden's argument was that he had to inject those massive amounts of money because everybody was broke because of COVID. So, did he really make a mistake doing it? Would have been worse for most Americans, especially working class and the poor, if he didn't provide that much COVID relief aid.
I think that's true, but I don't know how much of it would have been, how much worse it would have been had we not done anything, is what I'm saying. I liked getting the money. You like getting the money. I spent it. I saved it. I spent some of it. And I think, that's what most Americans did. There were a lot of people who squirreled the money away. I was, aghast at the number of people, the percentage of people that were surveyed who said, no, I didn't spend the money. I just put it in the bank.
So what do you think, Mark? Would it have been much worse if Biden hadn't provided all that money into the economy?
It's kind of a trade-off. With all the money going into the economy, you had a lot of people that didn't need the money. So they went out and they bought, I remember going down to Costco the day that the Biden checks were supposed to hit accounts, and you saw people just one after another wheeling plasma screen TVs out the door. They just went on massive shopping sprees, and that put a huge supply crunch because of all this extra money. But the real issue is when he shut down the economy, he was giving all these paychecks to people because he shut down the economy. But again, perfect example, shutting down the economy had a huge impact on the supply chain. Look at the food issue, back on that. Because the food processors couldn't clean and box the food at the factories because they were shut down, that food literally rotted on the loading decks.
And, just this week, there was a report that up to $100 billion might have been fraudulently acquired by people that were claiming that they had companies, so many employees, they inflated the number of employees. Others, it was outright fraud. They were under different identities.
Sure. So, there's always going to be people who do that. Anytime look at what happened with Hurricane Katrina. There was a lot of fraud connected with the aid that went, and that was just a small piece of potato compared to what the COVID relief package was. There's always going to be people who are going to try to screw the duck when something free comes along.
Yeah, but apparently, this was in spades because they wanted to get the money out quickly, and they figured they try to track down the con artists later on, and a fat chance of them recovering very much money from that. So again, the critics are saying it's another indication of the ineptitude of the Biden administration.
Mark?
I would agree with that. One of the things, a lot of the businesses, let's use like, gyms. People who are poor don't go to gyms. They just can't afford the membership fees. People who are kind of more wealthy can go to gyms. Well, one of the interesting thing about the gym structure is you're on that automatic debit card. So the gyms are still getting that monthly payment because they're on that automatic payment program from your credit card. But guess what? Those same gyms that were collecting the same amount of money before COVID and after COVID still put the forms in to take those special benefits to pay for their salaries, but their revenues never went down because of the automatic draft on the credit cards.
All right, Brian, let me ask you this. What should be done at this point to ease inflation and get the economy on a road to recovery? Is it something that Biden should be doing? Is it something that we should be doing as consumers? What's the solution as you see it, Bryant?
Well, I think that the trial balloon that they're putting up now to suspend the federal gas tax, just to lower the price by 14 or 18 cents, whatever it is now. That's nothing. Look, in the real world, the oil industry can raise prices and has raised prices 40 or 50 cents a gallon overnight. So cutting it by less than 20 is, kind of anemic in terms of its effect. So I would dismiss that one. But again, if you want to get things under control, the quick fix is to get energy prices under control. And I don't know how they're going to do that with this convoluted stuff with Ukraine going on. I don't see that happening yet.
All right, but again, you largely see this as companies taking advantage and artificially raising prices far beyond to cover their costs. Now, Biden himself has said a couple of times along those lines that he's called out companies, don't raise prices. But how do you achieve that in this kind of an economy, in this kind of a democratic system that we had? I mean, how do you force companies, require companies, mandate companies not to raise prices? Now, we've had price controls in other administrations, and I don't think those worked out very well.
No, they didn't. And jawboning is not going to work either. I think Biden goes on TV and it makes all these, highfalutin suggestions to people. That's really not going to work. And I'm a Biden supporter, but I don't see that as a fix. I think that this has to play out in the overall economy. And I think, as Mark says, we're on the cusp of a recession here. And if we do dip into recession, the question will be how deep and how fast we go in, and what effect that will have on demand for petroleum products, and how that will affect the overall price structure.
Okay, but Brian, what you said was that the way to fix the economy largely is to get energy prices down. How would you do that?
I don't know. That's what I'm telling you. Nothing seems to be in place in this set of circumstances that we had in other run-ups of energy costs. There's nothing that makes sense about the kind of price spirals that we've had if you look at the overall reason that's being stated for this, and that was Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I don't know how this is going to shake out. I really don't. This one puzzles me.
All right, Mark, you say that you do know how to bring down energy prices.
Correct. You just turn on the spigots and you say, just drill it, drill it, drill it, give land leases to Alaska, give special tax cuts to oil companies, and they'll drive the price of oil down so low, you'll never see oil prices or gas prices that low. It's a simple fix.
Do you agree, Bryant?
Well, I think that's right, but I don't know if it's going to happen. I think that there's a resistance to doing that. And here's my take on what we've allowed the oil industry to do over the past century. Even if you go back to Standard Oil, the days of Standard Oil, they were broken up ostensibly because the theory was that this industry was taking profits from the nation's natural resources to an excess level. They were allowing, the government was allowing the oil industry not to get a fair rate of return from mining the nation's oil supplies and coal supplies, but allowing them to profiteer. And the breakup of Standard Oil was supposed to fix some of that. And my suspicion is all it did was inject new players into the mix. And they continued doing the same thing, just more people at it.
That was largely because it was Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster.
Yeah.
He broke up the oil companies on the premise that they were monopolies.
Yeah.
And as you say, that just proliferated more companies taking.
That's right.
The same.
It didn't fix the problem. Mark can tell us that. And I think we've never reined in the mentality of the energy industry to stop profiteering from the nation's natural resources. I think that's a big issue with me.
Well, this goes to the heart of the concept of a free marketplace. Now, Mark, you say that that won't fix it. I mean, you bring down prices by turning on the spigot, right? I mean, so what Bryant is saying, you don't think applies at all.
I think it does cause, it's simple supply demand. Increased supply greater than demand. Every economic theory I've seen says prices should fall.
So therefore, it's not the oil companies taking advantage and price gouging. It's that the spigot has been turned down and sometimes turned off.
Correct, and you have demand has stayed roughly the same. Maybe it picked up a little bit, but when you make that massive a cut to the supply, prices are naturally going to go up. Not to mention, we're now relying on having to bring oil in from foreign countries. Those 500 million gallon oil tankers, it costs a lot of fuel to move oil from point A to point B across the ocean. That's an additional cost that we're incurring when we can pump in our own backyard and not pay the transportation cost. That's a huge cut right there alone.
500 million gallons. This is what those tankers require.
Well, no, that's how much they carry. So when you're pushing that much oil across the ocean, you're burning up thousands of barrels of oil per hour to push that ship across the ocean.
Yeah, and I went out just before this podcast today to buy diesel for my lawn tractor, $6.50 a gallon in Pennsylvania.
Not surprising. It's the same price here. We were talking before we went on the air here about home heating oil, which most people in New England use because fuel oil was always cheap here. I can remember as a kid, fuel oil was 16 cents a gallon. And that's why everybody heated with oil, because it was cheap. Now, of course, everybody would like to switch to natural gas, and that's a tremendous cost issue for even the most successful natural gas companies. In fact, our neighborhood, I circulated a petition when they were doing the sewers here a couple of years ago. And they were going to have the streets dug up anyway to have our local gas company come and put in gas lines. And anyone who could flip over from oil to natural gas would be able to do so at modest cost. Well, I approached the utility company and they said, oh no, we need written commitments from 92% of the people in your neighborhood, which is all flat and square, by the way, before we lay 1 foot of pipe. Well, come on. Somebody's always going to say no. And to get 92% of people to make a move like that in the absence of the kind of gasoline prices or fuel oil prices we have now was never going to happen. Today, maybe we'd see some more appetite for it. Well, I mean, but it's still an old thing. If if your ox is not being gored, you don't care. When your ox is gored, all of a sudden it's repulsive.
So, how do you fix something like that, among other things, in more regulations?
I don't know if regulation is the cure. I think that, you just have to, if you look, I told one of the vice presidents from Unitil, the company that we were dealing with, I said, look, I know state regulation prevents you from cost shifting to existing ratepayers the cost of connecting new customers to the system. And New Hampshire has that as one of its laws. So he said, well, so what are we supposed to do then? I said, well, go to your stockholders. I mean, do you want them to sell more product? Ask them if they're willing to foot some of that bill.
Yeah, but,
oh, can't do that, so.
Yeah, so the companies are not going to do it on its own. So what I'm saying is, you mentioned state regulation. So is the solution more regulation on the local, state, and federal level?
I don't think you're going to see that in New Hampshire. I mean, we have a solid Republican government here, and they're not going to go for that.
Yeah, but I mean, as a general concept, Mark, does regulation work to keep prices in check?
Well, it hasn't worked in the past. Let's put it that way. Mark can offer some more on that.
Well, technically it does not. You need regulations, but our government tends to want to over-regulate. And when you over-regulate, you bring in armies of lawyers to make sure you're staying in compliance. And all those lawyers that are charging all those massive fees, the consumer ends up paying those fees, not the corporation. It just gets passed down the road.
All right, consider now the current inflation rate, it dipped down just a bit, didn't it? What was it, 8.3? 8.3.
8.3.
And that still outpaces wages, any increase in wages. So, Mark, are we headed towards a recession? Are we in a recession? And if we're already in a recession, how bad, how soon will it get?
I think we are already in a recession. I mean, that would explain a lot of how the stock market's been performing. That would explain a lot of what's going on there. And if we're already in a recession and the Fed is raising interest rates, the sooner the Fed realizes that we're in a recession, the better, because you don't. That's one of the reasons why the Great Depression became great, was because the Federal Reserve kept raising interest rates during a recession and didn't realize it until it was way too late.
But, it's kind of a bind, isn't it? Because to tamp down inflation, you raise interest rates, but if you raise them too much for too long, then you're creating a counter effect. So, I mean, is it figuring out the precise balance, or is there nothing else they could do at this point except raise interest rates?
Well, I think the reason why they're raising rates is because they're getting all this blame that it's their fault for the inflation. So they're taking measures to do something to look proactive. Since the Fed was created in 1913, it was created basically to control inflation, add stability to the financial markets, prevent recessions. Since 1913, we've already had a Great Depression, the Great Recession of 2008. We have inflation. Why do we need a Federal Reserve if we've had more recessions, more depressions, and more inflation after the Federal Reserve came around than we did before? Why do we need the Fed?
So you think the Fed and its fluctuating interest rates as a tool to control the economy is fairly useless and counterproductive largely?
Correct. I believe a free floating market rate would be much better for instead of having a group of 11 or 12 people decide where interest rate should be. Let the free markets decide where the interest rate should be by trading it. And then you've got thousands of people who are a lot smarter than a lot of your Fed officials making bets on where that should actually go.
But wouldn't that be the Wild West of corporate power? And again, what Brian is getting at is, they go wild as soon as they get some opportunity.
Well, I think that my concern is that if you looked at the smartest people in the room in 2008, we were right on the cusp of another depression, and it took a lot of cajoling and threatening to pull the nation back from that. And I'm not so sure that people in the private sector can divorce themselves from the avarice that they have enjoyed for so many years for the betterment of the country. I think there's still a greed factor there that's always going to get in the way.
All right, so Brian, what you essentially are saying, I think, is that it's the companies taking advantage of this, but there's no way to stop that. And Mark is saying, I think, that the way to stop this is to bring down fuel costs and turn on the spigot again. So that's basically the difference in your arguments, is it not?
Well, I'm not saying don't start drilling again. I think that would be a smart move. Whether it produces the kind of immediate relief at the pump that we'd like to see is what the question is.
Well, we haven't actually talked about Biden's speech this week, where according to the critics, he blamed everybody else except himself and his administration. So, Mark, can you take us through his basic arguments and why you think they're not valid? What Biden said this week about inflation, the causes of it.
Well, he's definitely the cause of it. But one last thing I want to add about the Federal Reserve inflation, I think where the Fed's making their mistake is they're not really taking fully into effect that the inflation rate is already slowing the economy, because people, the Fed raises rates to pull money away from the consumer so they have less to spend. Well, the higher food prices and higher gas prices is already doing that for them. So I think the economy is going to start slowing a lot faster than what the Fed anticipates, and you could see a really bad problem here in the next 3 or 4 months.
You're talking about a worsening recession.
Correct, because of the inflation rate is already doing the job of the Fed.
Well, you say a real bad problem. So how bad would the recession get?
Depends on how much further the Federal Reserve pushes interest rates up.
Mm-hmm.
And they've talked recently about incremental increases, like 0.5%, 1/4%, on and on, correct? So if that continues, then you're saying it's going to be even more destructive for a recovery.
That is correct. They're going to try to find a balancing act. As they raise the interest rates, the inflation rate theoretically should come down, and it should find a happy medium between the two. But I think because we already had a first quarter GDP number that was negative, if this quarter comes in negative as well, technically that's the textbook definition of a recession. And here you are with the Fed raising interest rates in the quarter that's already in a recession.
Right.
I think that's true. And I think Mark has a valid point with saying that it's time to hit the brakes on unnecessary rate hikes for interest rates. Now, whether that's going to be something that this Fed does, who knows? I watch the poll numbers for Democratic candidates. If they're as bad as they are now, and they're not irretrievable now, but if they get worse, you'll see pressure on the Fed to knock it off with the rate hikes. I think that's a given. And whether they listen is another issue.
And Mark, Biden blamed a number of factors and elements and people. Can you go through those quickly for us?
Oh, he named everybody. I mean, he blamed it on COVID. He blamed it on China with the lockdowns with supply. He blamed Putin. The list just goes on and on. But obviously, I don't think he knows anything about economics. The government spending that he did caused it. I mean, that's basic Keynesian economics right there. You spend a lot of money, you flood the system with a lot of free money, it's going to cause inflation. And then to really seal the deal, you even had the transportation secretary come out and say, yes, all the stimulus caused the inflation. So Biden, of course, this is Biden's thing. He's stuck in a position. He has to blame somebody else. He's going in the history books as the worst president in history, and he's about to take a beating in the midterms. He can't take the responsibility for this. Let's just face it, he's a terrible president.
Right. You have a contrary opinion, I believe.
I don't think he's a terrible president, but I think he's stumbling badly. And whether he can pull this off in terms of mitigating the usual loss of seats in the midterm elections remains to be seen. The polls are fairly tight in many of the swing states. So it's not the walkaway that we've seen in other midterms. It's certainly not what we saw in 2018 when the Democrats romped to victory in both chambers of the House of the Congress. So I think the closer we get to November, and the closer we look at these polls to see which Republican candidates are going to be victorious or are likely to be victorious, will determine how Biden is perceived as a current president, and more importantly, as Mark points out, in the history books.
You know, a question that's coming up more and more with commentators on TV and elsewhere is that what do the Democrats really have to run on to justify them being elected or reelected? I mean, what could they sell to the public that sounds credible? What are the issues they could say what they've done for the country? And Brian, you know, I know you're a big supporter of Democrats generally because you think Republicans are, you know, ripping off the working class. So, you know, what can they tell the voters are good reasons to elect them or reelect them upcoming in the midterms?
Well, my suspicion is that if they maintain the Senate and manage to put 2 more seats up so that they have enough votes to mitigate Manchin and Sinema, then you're going to see a lot happen in the second 2 years of the Biden administration that could not happen because of those 2 guys.
All right, but going into the midterms, what can they sell to the public as reasons for them being returned to office or elected to office? Now, what are the selling points?
The selling points are simple. What did the Republicans give us for 4 years of Trump? A super rich tax cut. Stop there. That's all they did in 4 years, except pack the Supreme Court with narrow-minded people that are now going to cause trouble on another front. So, you know, why would you think that putting more Republicans in government would produce a different result than all of the chances they've had up to now? That's crazy. Makes no sense.
Mark, I know you have a starkly different opinion on this.
Well, yeah, I do. And that is under Trump, people were happy. Gas prices were low. They could buy baby formula if they went to the store. As an individual person, as Ronald Reagan said, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And I think everybody, if you asked them right now, would say, yeah, I was a lot better off 4 years ago than I am today, because Biden is just slamming it to the floor. I mean, he can't make a decision. He should really do the Jerry Steinfeld thing with Costanza, do the opposite of what you think's right, because he's got a track 100% wrong on everything.
Bryant?
Well, I don't go quite that far, needless to say, but I think there are things that Biden clearly is hesitating on that should have been done much more quickly. If you're going to do something to cut the gas tax, for instance, at the federal level, do it. Don't talk about it for weeks on end. Do it. Get something done so that you can point to that in the voting booth and say, this is what I've tried to do for you. Now it's time for you to decide whether you want to go back to what the Republicans gave us for 4 years, or do you want to take a chance and do something different that might help a lot more people in the middle class than ever got helped under Donald Trump.
Mark, how much cutting the federal gas tax, how much would that have brought prices down per gallon?
That really won't have any impact whatsoever.
No, I don't think so either. No.
So, Brian, I mean, your argument just now was that he should have cut the federal.
I'm just giving you an example. Do something. Do something instead of whining about who's responsible for it. If you're going to take control of government, do something.
But if you do something and it's not successful, it has no effect, then how effective is that as a selling point?
If you do nothing, that's worse.
Well, yeah, and just to drive the point home, you know, we have all those ships sitting off the coast of California that are loaded with, you know, supplies to bring into the United States. You know, they're so backlogged right now. Of course, they're working it down. But the reason why we can't get stuff is because of those ships. Biden, under the Defense Act that was put in place that Donald Trump activated, under the Defense Act, Joe Biden as president can sign an executive order and order those ships that are off the coast of California to sail around South America and dock in Virginia, Florida, Houston, Texas, and unload their ships there. But they won't do it because California wants those port docking fees and they don't want to lose all that money because, let's admit it, California likes to spend other people's money.
Well, and the fact is, to even go through the canal, to wind up in the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico is still an expensive proposition for each one of those ships. So owners of those ships are going to resist that too.
Well, and not to mention, a lot of those ships are too big to even sail through the Panama Canal today.
Yeah, that's
Mark,
true.
how would you answer Bryant's argument, a common argument among Democrats, that the Republicans are trying to screw the working class? They're going after Social Security, that the working class people are much better off traditionally and still under Democratic leadership. How would you answer that?
Well, my mother was a diehard Democrat. And one day I actually sat down and I took the Democratic platform, their top 10 things, and the Republican platform, and I went through and I read off the top 10 Democrats and I disagree with all those, read off the top 10 Republicans that I agree with every one of those. I said, congratulations, Mom, you're a Republican. No, I'm not. I'm Democrat. So it's a marketing ploy that the Democrats have used to make people think the Republicans are trying to push the poor people down, but it's not. I mean, look at the polls. You've had a record number of African-American people, Hispanics, which have traditionally been Democratic, are now coming over to the Republican Party because they're seeing that the Democratic Party has done nothing for them, and in a lot of cases have made their situations worse.
But there's no validity to the argument that Republicans are really oriented towards profit, oriented towards big money, big corporations, and this whole thing about trickle down and all that really doesn't work. And it's the Democrats that really, at least in the past, have raised living standards for the working class, for the common folks.
Well, there's validity to that. I think that you make a valid point, Larry, that we had in conversations before, that the Democrats and the Republicans are now drinking at the same trough of campaign contributions, and that makes it very difficult to differentiate the parties. So it becomes a question of what keystone issues are going to resonate with voters.
See, Brian, that's what I'm saying, that traditionally Democrats were champions of the working class, and they did improve conditions of the working class.
Oh yeah.
But now the parties really have melded together, and they're both feeding off the public trough, as you like to say. They're both grabbing whatever they can. They're career politicians, and the working class, the middle class, be damned. I mean, that's the way I see it. That the Democrats who were associated with helping the working class, that's gone now. They act like you think Republicans have always acted.
Well, keep in mind that when you looked at the nation's manufacturing sector, and you take a look at what happened under both parties in terms of outsourcing of jobs overseas where they were cheaper, and we talked about the Jack Welch factor with GE. I was very good friends with the PR person for GE, named Frank Donovan, and Frank said, Jack Welch saved this company. And I looked at him, I said, oh, come on, Frank, Jesus. You could have trained a chimpanzee to do what Jack Welch did with GE. And all he did was look around for the cheapest country to export jobs to. That didn't take any talent. And that amplify that by other companies, big companies, small companies, medium-sized companies, and look what you get. No manufacturing base left.
I agree with you, but my question is, who allowed that? It was only the Republicans that had allowed the outsourcing, this wave of it. It was only Republicans that engineered that. My perception is that it was both sides that agreed with that, because they're being funded by the big corporations that wanted to make money by outsourcing. So their campaigns were funded by these corporations. So they didn't buck them. They enabled this.
Look, NAFTA was the brainchild of Bush 41, but Clinton turned it into an art form. So yeah, there's some validity to what you're saying. I don't know who's got more blame here, but look, the horse got away, and both sides were not looking at the gate.
It wasn't that they weren't. They were looking at the profits that were going to be made in China and the contributions they'd be getting from these corporations who donate to them. They're also involved with their own deals. I mean, look at here, it's not Democrats only. Mitch McConnell, he's so tied in with China's interests because his wife's family owns a big Chinese company. So he's not going to buck China, and he has very little criticism for China. And the Democrats do the same thing. Hunter Biden making money off of China, Russia, and Ukraine. I mean, they're all have their hands out. And this is what's happening. The Chinese have a concept called elite capture. They go after those in power. They go after those with money. They offer them great deals. And that's how they capture them at the expense of the American public and the working class. So the Democrats are no worse than the Republicans. They're both guilty of this exodus of American jobs abroad.
Mark?
I would agree with that. Talking about the Republican Democrats, JFK, if JFK was alive today, he'd be called a Republican because he was a conservative Democrat.
Yeah.
I think what you're seeing as a problem is historically, I think you've had kind of an even balance of liberals and conservatives, and you had that moderate base that kind of swayed who was going to be in power. But to me, it looks like the moderate base has just totally collapsed, and you're either diehard Democrat or you're diehard conservative, and there's no one in the middle to really balance out the winner at the end of the day.
That's right. For years, 40% of the people were voted Republican for president, 40% voted Democrat, and the 20% in the middle decided the election. We know that. That went on for decades. I don't know that you can say that anymore.
Yeah, see, Brian, I think you're still under the what I consider a delusion that the Democrats are still the champions of the working class. They are now champions of the big corporations that they're tied in with, the same thing as Republicans. So what I'm saying is neither party is for the working or the middle class anymore. And that's the big predicament with this country.
Well, I think that's what got Trump elected. I think a lot of that frustration is what propelled this new face in politics into office. And then we saw what he did not do. But, that aside, the frustration of the American voter is obvious. Whether either party has the wherewithal and the gumption to fix it, who knows? I don't see that happening. Even now, I don't see it.
Mark, do you see it either way?
At the end of the day, humans are humans. They're all going to want, they're all going to be greedy. They're always going to want things. Whether you wear the Republican hat or a Democrat hat, at the end of the day, you're going to look out for yourself. And if you can get a deal from China or wherever, you're going to take that. That's just human instinct.
Yeah.
The game that they play today is who can cover it up the best.
Yeah, and who allows it? Both sides allowed this. They allowed that outsourcing because they and their friends and the corporations that sponsored them were all making money. So,
let me ask you then, what's the solution?
The solution, well, you can't close the barn door after the horses run away. I don't see how they're going to bring jobs back to this country.
They're not
in any volume. So, people have said, and I think there's increasing validity to it, that this century is China's century. They're going to be the dominant power, not the United States. They're going to be kicking us out of their sphere of influence there with Taiwan. That's going to be the first step. And that whole region now, they're already controlling, even Australia, they're controlling with businesses buying up farmland and all that. So, the tentacles are extending, and we have allowed that because we made profits. So what's the solution? The solution is to have some principled people in office that, but even then, I don't think there is a solution. It's too late. China is on the rise. We're on decline. It's going to take a while. Maybe it'll be more precipitous than I imagine. But the long-term trend, by the end of the century, China is going to be calling the shots. And hopefully, we'll still have our freedom and the Constitution. That's my parting words here.
Well, I think there's some suspicious reality to what you say, and I get back to what that senior master sergeant told me back in 1968 when we were in Thailand debating the military industrial complex. And he looked at me with a straight face and said, Bryant, it took Rome 500 years to fall. It'll take this country less than 3.
Yeah.
And it scared the shit out of me, pardon my French. And I said, maybe you're onto something here.
Yeah, it's, I'm a capitalist because it corresponds with human nature, human needs, human emotions. Socialism and communism, it was good in theory to an extent, but it doesn't work out that way because it descends into totalitarianism. Mm-hmm. And people, want a piece of their own action themselves. They want to get the rewards for what work they put into it. This communal stuff, it always deteriorates. Back in the 1800s, they have several of these utopian communities experimented with these concepts that everybody equal work and this and that. Yeah, it fell apart because nobody was doing equal work. Some people were taking advantage. Some people were loafing.
Human nature.
Human nature. So that's why capitalism works because it corresponds to human nature. However, unbridled capitalism doesn't work. And that's what we've had more and more under both the Republicans and the Democrats. That's what's wrong. That's how it all went haywire. You can't have unregulated capitalism. You can't have too much regulation, but you can't let it go wild as it has done, and with everything going to China, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, parting words, where are we going to be a year from now? Bryant.
Well, there's a good chance the Republicans will take back the Senate. I'm not so sure about the House yet because there's too many retirees, that are putting swing seats into play. If that is the case, then we're stuck with gridlock government for another 2 years.
Mark?
I think you'll see the Senate and the House both flip to GOP, and you'll probably see Joe Biden will probably have to come to the center and start implementing moderate policies, very much like how Bill Clinton did during his midterms when the House of Representatives went so hard to the Republican side.
Well, my prediction is that I'm not necessarily convinced that the Republicans are going to sweep in the midterms, but the main reason why, and I may be banned for saying this, but the mail-in ballots. If they create another COVID crisis or some other crisis where mail-in ballots are necessary, that's where suspicious behavior, that's where questionable election behavior can come in. I'm not saying that will happen. I'm not saying it will be fixed. I'm saying mail-in balloting is not a good thing for democracy.
We'll see.
So that's it, guys. Thanks once again for everybody's opinions and insights. Thanks out there for listening to us. And we'll see you soon with more issues from the left, the right, and I think the center. So, see you later. Thanks.
Good night.
Thanks.